Welcome to Tales Folklore Stories channel. Without wasting our time, let's get to the watch. The throne room of Nyazura was a place of gold and shadows. The walls, carved with the faces of kings long dead, seemed to whisper warnings to anyone who dared listen. Their empty eyes stared down at the woman who now ruled, the one who had slaughtered her way to the top. Queen Adana sat on the throne, her black robes flowing around her like ink spilled on stone. Her fingers, adorned with rings of ruby, ivory, and bone, tapped against the armrest. Beneath her feet, the floor was smooth, polished with the blood of those who had challenged her rule. She was waiting for her son. The doors swung open. Prince Amari entered, his boots echoing through the silent chamber. He was tall, strong, a young warrior forged in fire. His face, sharp like a blade, remained unreadable, but his dark eyes held something dangerous. Doubt. Adana saw it. She hated it. "You hesitate," she said, her voice smooth but cold. "That is weakness, Amari." The young prince stood before her, fists clenched. "You asked for me, mother." Adana leaned forward, studying him like a lioness studies her cub, wondering if he was ready to hunt or if she would have to devour him herself. "There was an attack last night," she said. "Men who once swore loyalty to your father tried to steal from the royal treasury. We caught them." A single clap of her hands, and the guards dragged in 3 prisoners, men with dirt-streaked faces, their wrists bound in chains. One of them was crying. "They beg for mercy," Adana sneered. "But tell me, my son, what have I always taught you about mercy?" Amari's jaw tightened. He knew the answer. He had heard it since he was a child, whispered into his ear like a dark lullaby. "Mercy is the lie of the weak," he recited, his voice barely above a whisper. Adana smiled, but it was not a kind smile. "Then prove it," she said. The guards handed him a sword. It was heavy, cold, and glowed under the torchlight. The same sword his father once carried. The father Amari barely remembered. The father Adana had sworn was too weak to survive. He looked at the prisoners. Their eyes pleaded with him. One of them, an old man, fell to his knees. "Your father was a good king, my prince. He would never have—" Slash! The old man choked on his own blood before he could finish. Queen Adana had moved faster than a snake, drawing a dagger from her sleeve and slicing the man's throat open. She flicked the blood off her blade like it was nothing. "A good king," she mocked, "and look where it got him." The remaining 2 prisoners shook in terror. The room felt colder, even though the flame still burned in the torches. Adana turned to Amari. Her eyes gleamed like a predator's. "Now it's your turn," she whispered. Amari gripped the sword. His heart thumped in his chest, a war drum in his ribcage. One cut, one life, one choice. If he killed them, he would prove to his mother that he was strong, that he was worthy of the crown, that he was the son of a queen who feared nothing. If he didn't, he would be the next one on his knees. He raised the sword. The younger prisoner sobbed, his eyes wide with terror. "Please, please, I have a son. He's only 5 years old. I was only trying to." The words burned in Amari's ears. A son. A father. His father had died because of this throne. Hadn't he? His fingers tightened on the hilt. His breath came sharp and fast. His mother's voice whispered in his mind. "Mercy is the lie of the weak." He closed his eyes and swung. The sound of steel meeting flesh was deafening. The sword felt like thunder in his hands, its weight almost too much to bear. He heard the gasp of pain. The warm spray of blood hit his cheek. The prisoner collapsed. The second man lay motionless beside him. Dead. The last prisoner wailed, screaming so loudly the walls themselves seemed to tremble. But Queen Adana? She only smiled. She stood from her throne, walking slowly toward Amari. She lifted a single finger and wiped the blood from his cheek, smearing it like war paint. "My son," she whispered, her voice like silk wrapping around his throat. "You have finally begun to understand." But had he? Amari looked at the lifeless bodies before him. His hands shook, his heart pounded, but his face remained cold. Because he knew one thing. If he showed even a flicker of remorse, his mother would make sure he was next. So he swallowed the pain, buried it, hid it deep where she couldn't find it. For now, Adana turned back toward the throne. "Come," she commanded. "Your coronation is near. The people must see their prince become the ruler they deserve." Amari followed, his steps heavy with the weight of his first kill. But that night, when the torches dimmed and the palace fell silent, he did not sleep. Because in the darkest corner of his mind, a voice whispered back, "A king who rules with fear dies alone." And for the first time, Amari wondered, was his mother truly as powerful as she seemed, or was she just terrified of what love could do? The grand palace of Nyazura stood under the moon's silver gaze, its golden towers piercing the night sky like ancient spears. Inside the throne room, lit only by flickering torches, Queen Adana sat in her seat of power, draped in royal blue robes embroidered with golden symbols of conquest. Her sharp, piercing eyes studied her son, Prince Amari, who knelt before her. The air was thick with tension. The queen's voice, smooth yet laced with iron, broke the silence. "You have disappointed me, Amari." Amari clenched his fists, his heart beat like a drum in his ears. He knew why he was here. She had found out. His secret was no longer a secret. Zuri, the girl he had loved since childhood. The only one who saw beyond his title, who spoke to the boy inside him, not the prince the world feared. Queen Adana rose from her throne, her robe flowing behind her like the dark wings of a great vulture. She stepped down the marble steps, her golden sandals clicking against the stone floor. She stood over Amari, tilting his chin up with one sharp nail. "I warned you about weakness," she whispered. "And yet you have let love infect you like a disease." Amari did not respond. He knew his mother too well. Silence was his only shield. She let out a slow, disappointed sigh. "You have one chance to prove you are still my son. You must kill her." Amari's stomach twisted. Kill Zuri? The very thought sent ice through his veins. Adana circled him like a lioness sizing up her prey. "She has poisoned your mind. If you do not end her, I will. But know this, Amari, if I kill her, it will not be swift." The words cut deeper than any sword. Amari stood, his legs weak but his heart defiant. "You always say power is everything," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "But what if you're wrong? What if there is another way?" Adana's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Then prove it to me. Prove that love is stronger than power. But if you fail, she dies, and so do you." She clapped her hands. The palace doors swung open, and 2 guards dragged Zuri into the throne room. Her wrists were bound, her white dress torn, but her eyes burned with fierce courage. "Amari," she whispered. His breath caught in his throat. "Kill her," the queen commanded, tossing a dagger at his feet. A sharp silver dagger. One stroke, and Zuri would be gone. Amari reached down and picked it up. The guards held Zuri still. She did not fight, she only looked at him, her gaze steady, trusting. His mother was watching. His future was watching. The dagger felt like fire in his hands. Adana's voice was a whisper in the dark. "Strike, my son. Prove you are strong." Amari's mind raced. If he killed Zuri, he would become the king his mother wanted. A ruler without mercy. A man made of stone. But if he refused, his mother would never let them escape. His choice had already been made. In a flash, Amari turned and slashed, not at Zuri, but at the guards. The sharp blade cut through the air, slicing across the first guard's arm. He howled in pain, stumbling back. The second guard lunged, but Amari was faster, twisting and slamming the hilt of the dagger into his skull. The throne room exploded into chaos. Zuri broke free, grabbing a fallen spear and spinning to face the guards. Amari grabbed her hand, their eyes locking in silent understanding. "Run!" They bolted for the doors, but Adana's voice rang out like thunder. "Seize them!" More guards stormed into the room, blocking their escape. Zuri pressed against Amari's side, her breath ragged. "We're trapped." Amari's heart pounded. He turned to face his mother. She stood at the top of the steps, unmoving, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she clapped her hands. Clap, clap, clap. A slow, mocking applause. Impressive. Her voice was calm, too calm. "So you have chosen the path of fools." She lifted her chin. "Very well. Let the people decide your fate." Amari's blood ran cold. He knew what that meant. Tomorrow at dawn, he and Zuri would face the kingdom in the execution square, and only one of them would leave alive. The moon hung heavy and red over the palace of Nyazura, casting long shadows across the royal courtyard. The air smelled of burning torches and the iron tang of war. Cries of battle echoed through the stone corridors as Prince Amari, sword in hand, stepped into the great hall. The place where kings were made and unmade. Across the marble floor, Queen Adana stood like a phantom in black robes, her golden crown gleaming under the flickering firelight. Her dark eyes held no love, no softness, only the cold calculation of a ruler who had shaped kingdoms and crushed men beneath her heel. But tonight, she was not looking at just any man. She was looking at her own son, the boy she had raised, the boy she had hardened into steel. "You have disappointed me, Amari." Her voice was smooth, yet edged with quiet fury. "I gave you power, and you have thrown it away for love. Tell me, does she make you stronger?" She took a slow step forward. "Or weaker?" Amari gripped his sword tightly, his pulse roaring in his ears. "Strength is not cruelty, Mother. You made me believe love was a weakness. But I see now, it is the one thing that separates us from monsters." Adana laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed through the hall. "Then let us see, my son, if your love can save you now." She drew her sword in a single swift motion, its silver edge gleaming like the fangs of a viper. Without another word, she lunged. Amari barely had time to raise his sword before steel clashed against steel, sending shockwaves up his arms. Adana was fast, too fast for a woman of her years. She moved like a shadow, striking with the precision of a trained assassin. Clang! Slash! Thrust! Their blades screamed against each other as they danced across the great hall, knocking over golden braziers and spilling hot embers onto the stone floor. The fight was brutal, unforgiving. Each strike was not just a test of skill, but a battle of wills. Adana's blade grazed Amari's arm, drawing blood. Pain burned through him, but he refused to falter. "Still hesitating?" she taunted. "Still hoping for a mother's love?" She struck low, aiming for his legs, but Amari twisted away, countering with a powerful slash that nearly knocked the sword from her hands. For the first time, Adana's eyes flashed with something close to surprise. "You've improved," she admitted, her breathing heavy. "But not enough." With a sudden burst of speed, she kicked him hard in the chest. Amari stumbled backward, crashing into a stone pillar. Before he could recover, Adana pressed her sword to his throat. "This is where it ends," she whispered. "If you won't kill me, You will die as a fool." Amari's heart pounded. He saw his future in that moment. A ruler with blood on his hands or a dead man with love in his heart. But then he thought of Zuri, her laughter, her kindness, her belief that there was another way, and in that instant, he knew what he had to do. Amari let go of his sword. It clattered to the floor, the sound ringing like a funeral bell. Adana frowned. "You surrender?" "No." His eyes burned with something stronger than fear. Conviction. "I am choosing my own path." And before Adana could react, Amari grabbed her wrist, twisting it with a force she never expected. Her sword fell. In the blink of an eye, he turned the blade against her, pressing it just beneath her chin. For the first time in his life, Queen Adana looked vulnerable. Not because she was afraid of death. No, she had lived her life dancing with death. But because for the first time her son had outplayed her. Amari met her gaze. "It ends here, Mother." A long silence stretched between them, thick with history, pain, and the weight of choices. Then Adana smiled, not the cold, cruel smile she always wore, but something different, something almost proud. "You truly are my son," she murmured, and with that she stepped back, raising her hands in surrender. "Kill me then. Take your throne." Amari's grip on the sword tightened. He could do it. He had every reason to. But instead, he lowered the blade. "I will not become you," he said, turning away. Adana studied him for a long moment before laughing softly. "Then let's see how long you survive, my son. Mercy is the seed of betrayal, and you have planted it well." She took a slow step back, then another. Then she vanished into the shadows, disappearing into exile. The doors to the hall burst open as Zuri and the loyal rebels entered. When they saw Amari standing victorious, his mother gone, cheers erupted through the palace. "You did it," Zuri whispered, running to him, touching his face, her eyes full of relief. Amari, breathless, looked around. The kingdom was his. The weight of the crown settled on his shoulders, heavier than he ever imagined. Would he be the king his mother warned him against, or would he prove her wrong? As he looked into Zuri's hopeful eyes, he made his choice. A new reign had begun, but somewhere in the shadows, Adana watched, and she was waiting. Please subscribe, like, and comment. Thanks.